So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Hayley White, and I'm the Small Farms Coordinator in Marion and Polk counties. And I have a background in livestock. I have experience and degrees in ag education, specifically for adults, and then livestock and rangeland management. So I've been working in this position for about 3 years, and with my background, I typically teach classes around pastures and livestock. So without further ado, we will jump into it. Today, we will be using some polls. This is not a requirement if you don't want to do it. They are anonymous. It just kind of gives us an idea, kind of gauge knowledge as we go through, and to keep things fun and interesting, because who doesn't love kind of a pop quiz? So we have a quick practice poll. Give me just 1 second here. All right, so we have our test poll. If any of you have been reading the news, there's something going on with Cape Middleton. It's not related to pasture, and you're right. You might think, who the heck cares? But this is just a demo for our poll, and kind of to kick things off. So we'll have some polls throughout, and it's really helpful to us if you fill them out, but it's not required if you don't have the right equipment or you're just not interested. So, all right, we have plenty of possibilities for Cape Middleton and where she could be at the moment. So thank you very much. Okay, so for today's agenda, I typically like to start from the ground up. So we're going to soil, then we'll talk about our forage plants, why it's important to know your livestock, and how to manage all of them effectively to work smarter and not harder for better pastures. Okay. And so the question is, why should I invest my time and resources to manage my pasture? And a big reason is utilize your resource. If you have pasture, you can grow pasture effectively. You have more feed available for your animals, and you have better quality feed. Having good pasture just allows for more nutrients, and it's a mostly free resource that you can utilize. It increases animal performance. When animals have access to productive pasture and they can meet all their nutritional requirements and get full bites, which we'll go into later, it increases animal performance. And meanwhile, you are reducing your cost of supplemental feed. If you're managing your pastures effectively, you can reduce the amount of supplemental feed, whether it be hay, or mostly hay in that winter feed costs. With different animals, with chickens or hogs, it might be concentrates and things like that. But you're saving money and you're utilizing a resource that you already have. All right, a few things to keep in mind just to kind of get things started. A few scenarios that are really going to affect what you can do with your pasture is if you have too many animals in too small of an area. And where I see this a lot, and it's across species, but for example, if you have two acres of pasture and you've got 3 horses on it, you're not going to be able to manage that effectively as a pasture. You're going to have to treat it as a heavy use area. Because if you can never allow your pasture to rest, if you're constantly overstocking, you're not going to have a productive pasture, and you really need to manage it as a heavy use area. And heavy use areas are managed completely different. And that will be covered in section 3 with Susie Cloutier. She'll be going over heavy use areas and managing mud and manure. Another good thing to keep in mind is, where are you starting from? So if you have maybe some really, really poorly drained soils and your current forage plants are not a good match for it, it's going to be really hard to get up to the point where your pasture is being productive, because it's always going to be having an issue with your soil. If weeds are out of control and you're just gonna be paying a lot of money for herbicide to manage it. Meanwhile, you're not gonna have a lot of productive pasture plants that can compete with it. So you might need to renovate. And renovation will be covered in session 4 with Melissa Ferry. So don't worry, we've got you covered. But those are some things to keep in mind, is you can't get to your goals if you have some of these things that might be preventing you. So we have our next poll question now. All right, so as a pasture manager, what can you control? What are you in control of? All right, some results are coming in. Looks like soil fertility is definitely the popular one, for sure. Some others are saying root reserves, some are saying water, some are saying all of the above. Let them come in. Perfect. Thank you very much. All right. While I wish I could control the weather, I wish I could stop the hail today, have a nice balmy 75 degrees right now. I can't, but we can control more than we think as pasture managers. So the first one was soil fertility, and everybody had selected that one. It's true, you need to have your soil tested, and you can add nutrients as needed. And those nutrients can be, store-bought fertilizer. It can be compost that you take off your overwinter high use area and to reuse. And you can make sure that your soil has everything it needs to be healthy. 2 was water, and ways that we can have some control over the water in our pasture, other than if you have irrigation, is to prevent soil compaction. And so that will really be covered in the mud manure section. But if you have heavy animals on vulnerable wet soils, you're gonna get soil compaction, and the water will not be able to infiltrate your soil and get to your plant roots. You're gonna have a lot of runoff, you're gonna have ponding, versus if you have ground cover with proper root reserves, those plants will be able to uptake a lot of that water, and the water will be able to infiltrate your soil, and you'll have more water available for your plants. Grazing height can affect your canopy. Depending on kind of where you graze and your stubble height, you can increase the light that reaches the canopy. Now, of course, you don't want it to have it all the way to the ground because that is going to increase your soil temperature when you don't want it to. But if you have some lower growing forbs or legumes, you can get them some more light by making sure that you're timing your grazing height with when their season really takes off, to kind of help balance your grass and legume content. And the last one was root reserves, and a lot of you had that selected as well. Your rest periods and your grazing height are going to determine your root reserves. So you can control how much reserves your pasture plants have to either regrow in the same season or store reserves in the fall and be ready to go and bounce back in the spring. So I like to say that we do have a little bit more control there. So starting from the ground up, soils, just kind of a basic lesson here. Soils are a mixture of sand, clay, and silt, and your unique mixture will determine your soil characteristics. And why soil characteristics are so important, because they can be, excessively draining, well-drained, poorly drained, and a lot of times you'll have a mix as well. And these qualities, these characteristics affect which plants will do best, and a lot of times your management strategy. So if you have some really poorly draining soil, you're going to have to wait quite a bit longer before you can put your heavy, big-footed animals out there again. And your excessively draining soil, and especially in the summer season, your rest periods will have to be longer because it's not able to take up or store as much water. So that is how it can affect your forage plants. And knowing what's in your soil. In this area, our soils are typically pretty acidic, so many producers have to apply lime routinely. Nitrogen is another common one that people apply to their pastures in my area. However, unless you've had a test done in the somewhat recent past, or if you have had a test done, you're not seeing any problems, you probably have a pretty good idea. But if it's been a while, if it's over 5 years, or if you're seeing problems or big changes, negative changes in your pasture, I highly recommend having them tested. Why would you pay the money to purchase fertilizer, get the equipment out, pay the fuel, or what have you to apply nutrients if you don't even know if your pasture needs it? It's an easy way to throw away money. Soil samples are super easy to take yourself. OSU, we have a handy guide. You can take them yourself and send them to an accredited lab in Oregon. And we also have the list of accredited labs, and we have a list to help you interpret your results, kind of what you need to know, what you should take away. You can also just ask your local extension agent. You can talk to your local SWCB or your fertilizer dealer as well. I won't go too much into compaction here, but why soils are so important is if you have compacted soils, if you've had wet animals on your pasture, which is really hard to avoid in Oregon, I completely understand, in Western Oregon, that is, you're going to have more bare soil. You're going to have more weed pressure, more chances of erosion, reduce that water infiltration, and reduce your available forage. Anytime you have compaction, just leads to weeds and less forage for your animals to eat. So it's pretty important, even though it feels like we're always rainy and muddy here in Oregon. So along with animals, you're raising livestock, but you're also raising forage as well. It's just as important if you want to utilize your low-cost feed resource. And so knowing a bit about plants will help you to become a better manager. And while I know watching grass grow is not the most exciting activity, but it's really important in terms of grazing management and nutrition for your livestock. So to kind of give you the crash course spiel here, there are 3 plant stages. There's vegetative, elongation, and reproductive. Vegetative is when your plant is putting all of its energy into producing leaves. So it's pretty short to the ground. It's really leafy. It's really soft. It's really tender. And those there are growing points, and they are really low to the ground during this period, which is important to know. The next major stage, elongation, that's when typically things are warming up, we're getting longer growth days, our days are longer, and it starts putting out a long stem, and you're getting additional growth points as that stem elongates. So you still have some lower growing points down at the base, but also some additional ones as it spreads out and grows. Now, and a very important thing to remember, might come in handy, is that the end of the elongation stage is called the boot stage. And that means that it's just before the seed head is going to pop out of that leaf sheath. And so it's like right when the seed head is starting to develop. And then during the reproductive phase, that's when the seed head fully develops, pollination occurs, and the seed forms. Now back to the growing points that I mentioned. Let's see if you can see my little clicker here. So this is your crown of your plant. And here are the tillers, these kind of offshoots. And here's your main grass stem that will eventually become that elongated stem. And the growing points are kind of where there's a collar. You can kind of see a joint on the grass, and those are the growing points. And over here, you can see as the grass gets taller, you get those additional growth points and elongates. And it pushes new leaves up and elongates, but there are still growing points and nodes close to the bottom. And as animals graze them off, for example, I think this is on my next slide here. I guess we'll come to it. I'll get back to that soon. So at these different stages, the grass has different nutrient content. So it's really, really nutritious. It's sweet. It's tender when it's in that vegetative stage, when it's with developing all those leaves. If you've ever seen animals grazing in a pasture, that's what they want. It's the brand new soft stuff that's pretty delicious. It has a lot of nutrients. As we elongate, that dry matter increases and the nutrients are kind of spread out along the grass. And it starts to lose a little bit more, and as it gets fully mature, is at its lowest nutrient stage. When it's fully mature, the stems are fibrous. They're pretty indigestible compared to the leaves. There's a lot less leaves compared to stem, and it contains fewer high protein leaves. If anybody has pastures, and I'll give myself as an example, our old horse pasture, as much as I love them, my horses would all go and eat this really short, sweet vegetative stuff, or the clover and the legume, down to nothing. And then they would leave these big stemmy, I kind of call them wolfy plants. You'll see these big patches where there's this really tall, typically like a fescue, and they'll just leave those really big patches, little bunches, and go and eat all the good stuff. And so sometimes if they get kind of thick and gnarly, your animals aren't eating them. Sometimes it's best to mow them down to encourage kind of new growth if they're not eating them. And often it's kind of around where they defecate as well. Sometimes they'll have their areas depending on the species. And so you'll get a lot of tall wolfy plants and where they've their bathroom areas, I guess, good way to put it. So why is this important? And here's this graph that is showing along the bottom the vegetative stage. So there's that early stage where it's really leafy, green, but there's not a lot of it. The yield is low. And then the quality is high. So red is showing you the quality. When it starts out, when it's really young, it's really nutritious. As it matures, quality goes down. But as it goes through stages of maturity, you get more. So what you really want to do is aim for that sweet spot. You want to graze the grass towards the end of that elongation stage, right before the boot stage, when the seed head is enclosed, before the boot stage, when the seed is enclosed in the leaf sheath. If you can do that, it will keep using resources for vegetative growth. So if you hit it before that stage, it will put all of its energy into making more leaves, more vegetative growth. And if you leave it to go to seed, it kind of signals the plant that it's done. It's not going to waste its energy growing those leaves. And that's not what you want. So again, if you can get it right close to that stage or just before it, you'll keep using resources for vegetative growth. It's also going to be more palatable to your livestock. It's kind of that sweet spot. If you graze too short, on the other hand, if you graze it too short, those growing points are really, really close to the ground. And if you graze your animals and bite off that growth point, those low growing points, it has to start all over again instead of starting right at that first growth point. So it's going to regrow much slower. It's going to take you a lot longer, and you're wasting valuable resources. Now, I always like to really see these. It kind of puts it in perspective here as I talk about it. Picture on the left is kind of an example of if you're grazing for shorter periods of time, you're getting the animals off kind of after you've taken about half of the plant down. There's plenty of stubble, so you're cooling temperatures for your soil. It has plenty of roots to take up water. It has reserves to grow back a lot faster. As you can see here, here's another one where you did give it a break, but you grazed it quite a bit lower and for longer, and it doesn't have as much reserves stored in its roots. And then a continuous system, that's when they're going to be on that same pasture, that same area continuously, and you're left with very, very little root reserves and very little stubble height. It's going to take forever to grow back, and in the meantime, you'll have plenty of weeds growing in its place. And this is just a really cool picture. Obviously, it's older, but just shows the difference between stubble height of, grazing level and the amount of root reserves the plant has. Okay, so moving on to legumes. Legumes, I have to call them the ice cream plant. It's a top preference for most livestock. It's really nutritious. It provides protein and energy, and it's highly digestible. Legumes also fix nitrogen, which is great for soil health, can reduce your fertilizer requirements. The plant does this through the aid of bacteria called rhizobia living in the nodules in the roots of the plant. So rhizobia bacteria live symbiotically with the legume. And when you are, purchasing seeds, it's important to get seed that was pre-inoculated with that rhizobia bacteria. if you have old seed laying around in your barn that you haven't used for a long time, that bacteria does decrease rapidly with storage. So it'd be important to get new seed or re-inoculate it. And legumes grow more productively in the summer than grasses. Typically, they're kind of a late cool season or a warm season species. So this can be really helpful to your pastures once we get longer days, it's getting hotter and drier. Those legumes can really start to take over and do better and still produce you forage while the grasses are having a hard time if you have cool season grasses. Parts of the legume, much simpler here. We've got a taproot, we've got leaves that have leaflets in groups of 3 and they flower. They also, some varieties put out these stolons, which kind of grow along the surface and spread out. So they're kind of like a creeping, low growing, although some are upright like alfalfa. They have vegetative growth and then they move to the bud stage and then reproduction where they have flowers develop. And let's see. And all of the buds along the plant are regrowth points. So, you know, again, you're not wanting to graze these all the way down to the bottom. It's going to take them longer, but they typically can do a little bit better with grasses as long as they have some light coming down from the canopy. If you have really, really tall grasses all the time, they aren't going to be able to compete. So it's good to have a mix and to manage that grazing to encourage more legume growth. And they can grow upright or prostrate close to the ground, as kind of shown in this photo here. One thing to keep in mind with legumes is issues with bloat. So sure, many people know, but bloat is the excessive accumulation of gases in the rumen when animals are unable to belch that gas out due to the blockage. It can kill grazing animals very, very quickly. And it's common when animals consume damp, protein-rich legumes. And so that's why it's generally recommended that legumes supply no more than 50% of your pasture forage mix. There are some low bloat legumes like bird's foot trefoil and some others can be used instead of like alfalfa, which has kind of a high on the high side of risking bloat. Some things to keep in mind to prevent it is it's much better to prevent it than treat it. If anybody here has treated bloat, it's stressful for the animal, stressful for you. And once an animal bloats, it's pretty high likely that's going to occur again. And so most of the time you just need to cull those animals, unfortunately. This is why we'll have a session later on this, but it's good to have a relationship with your vet beforehand, before you have emergencies. So good reminder. Having a long tube that you can insert into the stomach. It's important for it to be not too soft or too hard because it can cause damage. And if it's too soft, it's hard to get down into that rumen, all the way down into the rumen. And you can add an anti-foaming agent like a mineral oil or vegetable oil. We kept a scent, you know, those like clear and free, scent-free detergents, just that you'd get for your laundry, but make sure it doesn't have any scents or any additives. We typically kept that on hand along with a garden hose that we cut the end off. So we kept that on hand to help with bloat. It's not fun to do, but it's really important to know how to do it in the case of an emergency. I wouldn't perform it without having talked to a vet or have or an experienced individual, or if you've seen somebody else do it. Just in case, because it is a stressful situation. So just some tips to prevent it. Never put hungry animals into a pasture with a high legume content. Always feed them hay first if you're not moving from one pasture to another, but just from a heavy use area or an enclosure to the pasture with legumes, because they'll gorge themselves, and feeding them before gives their digestive system time to adapt to the presence of legumes. Avoid letting them graze it first thing in the morning when they're typically dewy and wet. That increases your chances. Wait until later in the day when that dew has dried out. And they're also like bloat blocks. So if you can have a preventative, it's usually in a block form. There's also granular formed, and it needs to be consumed daily, typically to be effective. One thing to keep in mind if you are multi-species grazing is that some blocks that are made for cattle could be high in copper and often sheep can be sensitive to copper toxicity. So double check your label, get familiar with that, and you don't want to put something that could be toxic to one of your species out in your pasture. And really just check your animals frequently. Walk out, take a look at your animals, especially when you're making any big changes in their diet, moving them to a new pasture, especially one with a high legume content. All right, and now we are at the next poll question. 1 second here. Okay, poll question is, which plant stage is where plant quality and yield meet? Reproductive stage, end of elongation, vegetative, or beginning of elongation? All right, well, the good news is y'all remembered elongation. So I'm happy we're getting there. So the trick is, and I put a trick question in there, so that's really on me, but you want to hit it just before the boot stage, which is at the very end of elongation. So you want to get it just towards the end of elongation. That is when quality and yield meet. So you can most efficiently utilize your pasture resource. Thank you for participating. Okay, so last thing on plants here is species selection. And I won't go into this too deep because it could really be its own class. And two, a lot of it will be covered in the pasture renovation session. So the biggest thing to keep in mind when choosing forage species is to know your soil characteristics, because you want to pick something that's going to grow well and do best in your particular soil. And typically, a lot of places will have a mix of both. You also want to do it based on the animal species and the use. A good example is with horses. They're heavy hoof, and they're also just heavy themselves. And so if you have kind of a smaller area with horses and you have issues with soil compaction and bare ground, planting something like bent grass, it can really take a beating. It's a really tough and hardy grass. So that might be a really good option for like a run or a heavy use pen or a pasture that frequently has trouble. Other things, with your orchard grass can do really well on some sites, or it's going to get out competed with other species. And so it just really depends on your specific site. So if you are interested in pasture renovation, I highly recommend that you attend that session, but also share a very helpful publication towards the end that goes into selecting species based on your soil characteristics. All right, so we've gone over soil, we've gone over plants in kind of a crash course. Now it's getting to know your livestock. In case you didn't know, animals eat differently. Plant stage is really important. They have different plant preferences. They have different digestive systems, and some are more likely to graze, but all of them have the potential, except maybe the chicken I put in there. So let's start with kind of our sheep. Our sheep graze really close to the ground. They have a split upper lip, and they take small bites, but those bites are typically closer to the ground, and they can be really, really selective in what they eat. They can really pick out the plants they want. They can take smaller bites, so that aids in being more picky. They are light, they're smaller, so they can typically cause less hoof damage and compaction to wet soil compared to cattle and horses. However, when some soil is really wet, depending on the soil type you have, how much plant cover you have, vulnerable soils can still be affected. So especially in high use areas around water troughs and gates. Goats are similar in terms of their size and their hooves and their mouths as well. However, they're not going to be a big grass mower. So they like to browse on woody plants. They tend to want to eat up. They want to nibble those branches, brambles, anything woody, anything with thorns. Their mouths kind of are magical like that. They can kind of pick at what they want and avoid those thorns. But if you've got a really, really tall pasture, things are almost gone to seed. They're not going to be able to mow it down. They're not going to be as efficient in that. So having kind of those shorter, not too short, but shorter grazing heights will be helpful for them. But that's kind of where multi-species comes in handy, or especially if you want to use them to help control like Himalayan blackberry on your property. If you do want to use them to control Himalayan blackberry, and same with sheep, I do recommend kind of mowing or pre-cutting or making paths into your brambles so they have easier access, and they like to nibble on the new growth. So if it's new growth, they're more likely to eat it and be able to manage it well. Cattle, we've got a different mouth structure here. They're a lot bigger. Their mouths are huge. If you've ever been licked by a cow, you know how big their tongues are, and they have a different approach altogether. They open their mouths, they swing their tongue out. It scoops a huge mouthful of forage, brings it into their mouth, and they cut it with their bottom teeth. And so they're not able to be as selective as, say, a sheep that can really get in there and nibble at little things. Cows are going to take big bites and cut it off with their teeth. Sheep do it. They have a bottom pad that they use to kind of cut off. And they're really heavy, so they will really damage vulnerable soil. So it's very important to have a heavy use area. Moving on to camelids, like alpacas and llamas. They can be more selective with their mouth shape as well. They're lighter on their feet than cattle and horses. They can also take their pick of plants close to the ground, and they tend to not like tall stemmy grasses like some of the sheep and goats would. Alpacas especially prefer really low growing grasses and forbs. And really forb is pretty much any plant in your pasture that isn't a grass, tree, or a shrub. And one thing particular to camelids is I've heard that they might also require a little more space due to their social hierarchies. The top animals, sometimes depending on your herd, they can really be mean to the guy at the bottom of the line, and they might restrict their grazing and pick out all the great stuff and then leave, you know, the few that are at the bottom, just kind of the scraps. So it's really important to keep an eye out on your animals, because if those animals that are getting picked on, they might not be able to graze as much as the others, and you don't want them to lose body condition or not have enough food. So keep an eye on them. Horses, they're big, they're heavy, but they also have the combination of having really dexterous lips. They can be very picky, and they can also graze very close to the ground. Their lips are super strong. And so they are, like sheep, can overgraze and get closer to the ground more often than some other animals. Now, I'm not the expert necessarily on chickens or pastured hogs, but pastured pigs are typically much smaller in size than their conventional relatives. They're not ruminants, and they don't utilize forage as well as ruminants or pseudo-ruminants like the camelid. They have a digestive system that's pretty close to ours, and you can imagine if you were left to eat celery and kale and lettuce as your only meal all day, we wouldn't perform very well. So they need a different diet. They really need to be supplemented. About 50% of their diet should be supplemented or concentrated feeds. They can graze pastures best when it's early in that early vegetative state, when it's lower to the ground, because they are built lower to the ground. They also need shelter and a way to cool off in the summer, whereas some of the other animals are better at managing, have a higher heat tolerance. They also have a tendency to root and disturb the soil. So it's really important to utilize a heavy use area with hogs. Once they start kind of causing some damage, you know, kind of have certain grazing times when they're out there, and you know, make a heavy use area where they tend to want to root. So they can still have that rooting behavior in a managed area. All right, last but not least is the chicken. If you want to include chickens in your pasture system, which you surely can, they do best in pastures with shorter plant heights, so they can move around a lot easier, as you can imagine. And remember that they're really eating insects and seeds. They're not munching down mowing grass. It might kind of look like they are at times, but you need to have chicken feed available at all times. So having them out in your pastures, especially multi-species grazing, it can reduce your chicken feed costs because they're out there picking up grubs, eating seeds, picking stuff out of manure piles. So you'll, you know, save some on your chicken feed cost, but you still need to have it out there in case, you know, those populations go down and they don't have as much to eat. And it's hard for you to tell because you're not a chicken scratching around in the dirt. So it's important to know. And one more thing that is really important is you need to make sure that you're having a productive pasture that has enough forage. It doesn't have a ton of bare ground, because animals have a set amount of time for grazing every single day. And that goes, they have only as many bites in a day. So for an example, and this is just, I'm pulling this out of thin air, so don't write it down, but let's say a cow has enough time in the day for 1,000 bites. That's what it has. It can't go out and graze longer. It has that time for grazing. And so if it has to take all these little bites and it's not getting full mouths of feed, and you have really short pasture, you've got a lot of bare ground, so it really has to work to go get all these little bites all over, it's not meeting its nutrition needs. So that's why it's really important to either supplement their feed, or even better, make sure your pasture is productive. That goes for any of the grazing species that rely on forage. You really need to make sure. That's why it's so important. If they're out on pasture and it's not productive and it's short, it can really reduce their animal performance, reduces their intake, and you can have some issues. This just gives an example of some of the dry matter consumption required per month per species. Now, this is highly variable, of course, depending on breed, age, life stage. And so, it really depends, but it just kind of gives you an idea to keep in mind. It could really be a whole other class on calculating animal units per month to see how much forage your pasture has, and where you could calculate how many days. That's really a whole different class, but there are a lot of resources online, and this just kind of gives you an idea. And then the last part is being an effective manager, because you can't really be a hands-off manager when you're raising livestock. So, and you can't manage if you don't observe. So really, really important. I know it's one of those things that you're like, yeah, okay, I'm really not going to take up journaling, but thank you, Hayley, for the idea. Walk your pastures frequently. Check on the conditions, like your overall pasture condition. What growth stage is the pasture at that your animals are in? What's the weed pressure like? Are there poisonous plants? Because if you're not walking through, you don't know. And see how much the animals have eaten. Have they gotten to that halfway point? Have they gone too far? Have they gone not enough? Just take a look. Taking good notes with a date, so you can go back and read your notes to see if you're moving towards your goals, is really important. Pictures can also be really helpful, so you can see changes over time. And yeah, if you invest a lot of your time and resources, I think it's really cool to see the change that you're really making. You can look back and say, wow, my pastures look awesome. And then you can write me a letter and tell me all about it. And keep an eye on your animals too. Body condition scores, kind of their overall look, how they're looking. They look healthy. Do you notice any changes in behavior, general health? Animals typically kind of tell you, they might not perk up when you walk out there. When you're walking through your pasture, you want them all to lift their head and look at you. If ears are down, something like that, especially with like sheep, I swear sheep just want to die. And so you might not notice things ahead of time, but if you're walking through frequently and you're checking on your animals, you'll be the first to know. Now, I have a little example here, and I would just like to know, what are some observations you see in this pasture? And you can unmute and let us know. You could also write it in the chat. Anybody brave? Any brave souls? Okay, I see noticing people are noticing seed stage, definitely gone to seed for sure. Anything else about just kind of overall condition? I see monoculture, definitely. We see one main kind of grass throughout, right? All of these are correct. Some green, some dry. Is it bent grass? We see discoloration, all really good observations. Yeah, perfect. Okay, and that's exactly what I see. So this is a pasture that lots of grass, no bare spots. Okay, perfect. Okay. Well, thank you all for adding your input. Yeah, when I look over this, I see, okay, yeah, it's definitely later season. You can see a lot of seed heads or old seed heads. You see that different color. And to me, that color In this particular case, kind of indicates that this is probably a lot of kind of weedy annual species of grass, not necessarily ones that we love. I mean, all of them have different seed heads, so it's not necessarily that, but I just happen to know from this one, there's a lot of kind of weedy species that aren't that great, that don't necessarily produce a ton of great forage. But one thing I really wanted to show you is this is the same pasture in the same spot, but from above. This is why it's really important to walk your pastures. As somebody might look over across that and it looks like it's really filled in. You can see all the tops of those grasses. But when you're standing over it, you see that really it's almost 50% bare soil there. And you know, we've got some weeds. And in this particular case, it was for poisonous plants while I was out there. So bare spots, again, are going to lead to less productive forage, more weeds. We're just wasting a lot of ground here. Now, to be fair, this was during the summer, so things are going to be growing a little slower. It's going to be a little drier. That does have an effect on it, but still this pasture is in need of some help. So just to keep this in mind. And this is pasture that is not going to retain a lot of water. A lot of water is not going to get absorbed into those roots because there's not a lot of roots there. And the soil is so dry that it is cracked. We've probably got some compaction issues happening as well. So this is why it's important to walk your pastures. All right, let's get into some other management decisions that can have an effect. Please don't overgraze. If you can take one thing away, well, there's plenty to take away from this presentation, but overgrazing is so detrimental. Those plants cannot recover the lost nutrients. You're going to starve their root reserves, and they're eventually going to die or just really not be productive. You're losing your source of cheap and nutritious forage, and you're going to get a ton more weeds. You're going to be paying for herbicides or paying with back pain of being out there pulling them all the time. And you're going to have some erosion problems as well if that soil isn't covered and doesn't have those root systems holding in place. So how do you prevent it? We talked a little bit about it, but a really good rule of thumb is to take half, leave half. Depending on your type of grass, it's about 3 to 4 inches is as low as you want to go. If you follow that rule of thumb, you know, each plant's going to be bitten off about once relatively and then allowed to recover. Of course, you're going to lose some forage to, you know, getting stomped on, especially with big animals. But, you know, as they walk, as they lay down, not everything is going to be bit off once. It's not going to be perfect. But in general, if you're leaving that stubble height, you're going to preserve those growing points that we talked about. And it also reduces animal exposure to parasites. So animals, sheep and goats are especially notorious for getting parasites. But really any animal, when they're down close to the soil and often touching the soil, it's just going to increase your chance of pulling up those parasite eggs and develop parasites. And also, another way to prevent it is if your animals, you run out of paddocks, or if you have one paddock and they've grazed it down, especially if you're trying to make big changes with your pasture, I recommend supplemental feeding and having a heavy use area to put them into. I know it sounds like, Hayley, you're crazy. Why would I pay to buy supplemental feed when I have a pasture? Because you're going to ruin your pasture over time and you'll have less and less and less and be paying more and more and more for supplemental feed costs. So take care of your pastures and they will pay you back. Rotational grazing is a great way to reduce overgrazing. And what rotational grazing is, you have multiple paddocks so that some paddocks get rest. You know, there's a loop and gives the grazed plants time to regrow and restore their energy reserves. Really a good rule of thumb is as many as you can increase by is really helpful. So the more smaller areas you have, the better, because that gives you more paddocks to work with, more rotations. I mean, you don't need to get crazy and have 100 paddocks for a small area, but anything you can do to give your plants rest time will be really helpful. And what the other thing that this helps with is your animals have less opportunity to be more selective. So they, in a big open pasture with a continuous grazing season, they're going to go around to their favorites. They're going to go around to the ice cream plants like legumes and the really low, the brand new stuff, and they're going to continue to eat those while the stuff they don't like is going to get bigger and bigger, and they're going to continue to not eat it. So this kind of evens the playing field. They have to be less selective, and they'll utilize more of your forage. Here is a beautifully drawn example. This property, as you can see here, here's the house and barn and things like that. They currently have 4 pastures, 4 large pasture sections. These pasture sections have different drainages and slopes. You know, this might be a high slope over here leading to kind of a low area where things typically drain to. It might not, you know, it might, they might stay wetter here, be more vulnerable in wet spots. But they've got 4 large pastures. As you can tell by my beautiful drawing, this is permanent fencing where it has those little X's along it. So it's all permanent fencing right now. And just to give an example here, those 4 sections have been divided. And so now there are 8 smaller sections. And they were kind of divided based on fencing ease and land characteristics. So for example, you know, up here, you have a high area with slope. It's probably going to be better draining or well draining compared to a low area that's going to be poorly draining. They're going to have to be managed differently. And so having them sectioned off will be a lot easier. You know, when it's hot and dry in the summer, the south slope might need more time to rest versus a lower area that stays wetter longer. Might be a good time to graze in the hot summer. But first thing in the spring or after a rain, if the soil is saturated in the low area, that's not a good place to graze, and you want to have them somewhere else. My drawing was made with temporary fencing, which you can now see by the dotted lines. And so they added these sections here and here to kind of have a channel so that it could direct livestock to the different paddocks, but then utilize temporary fencing with those dotted lines. And so this helps, again, typically the more paddocks, the better. And it just allows you to have more management options, allows you to have more control in terms of managing your grazing. And the plant stage, you know, so you can move them when you hit that desired plant stage, move them to a different area, and it can be helpful. Again, this is just an example. I also understand that everyone has different time available and resources. And so even if you can split your pasture into 2, it really will help. Now, pros and cons. Pros, let's start with those to be positive. The forage is going to be more productive. There's more time for rest, better soil health, and you can keep animals off sensitive areas. It's more labor intensive. You're going to have to get out. You'll have to move them more often. You'll have that cost of fencing. So again, do what you can with what you have. But if you want to see change, got to try new things. How long should your pastures rest? This really depends on several factors. Period in the growing season, availability of water. If you have irrigation, can be shorter. If it gets hot and dry summer, pastures are going to take longer to grow. Amount of active leaf area. So what did you leave the stubble height at? What are those root reserves left at? That will determine how fast they can bounce back. And also depends on the type of grass. So your cool season grasses are going to recover more quickly in the spring and the autumn. But really, you should rest your pastures until they recover. And you'll know because you walked out there, you have pictures from when you started, you can see differences. Oh, and let's see, here is my difference I was going to talk about with different plants. Your cool season grasses or your grass and legume mixes should be left with 3 to 4 inches of leaf area for a rapid recovery. And your warm season grasses are more variable, and they can be between 4 to 8 inches of stubble height. So it really depends on your grass, but a take half, leave half is a good, easy way to remember. Another important thing, fall is really critical for your pastures. It's the most critical in terms of the timing. We have shortening day length, cooler temperatures, and it's really putting a lot into its storage. And so if you're overgrazing in the fall, which I beg you not to, they will not bounce back in the spring. Doesn't matter if we had a really long winter and a wet spring. What you set them up for in the fall is how they will react in the spring. All right, so quick recap here, just to tie everything together. For more productive pastures, you're going to work smarter by starting with healthy soil. Get your soil tested, make sure you're reducing compaction, select the right plant species for your soil, for your species, for your individual, your goals. Know your animal species, know what their nutrient requirements are, how they graze, their behavior, and rest your pastures and do not overgraze them. If you follow those, I just about guarantee that you will be rewarded with more forage growth, better quality forage, and you'll have increased livestock performance and increased profitability. So if you put in that work to observe, measure, and change, because it takes all three of those, you'll be rewarded. And I do have some pasture resources to share, which I will include in an email following up so you can have easy access to them. But we have a great pasture management guide. There's a free online course if you want a more in-depth course at your own pace. There's one online. It is currently free. And there's also a pasture calendar, which kind of gives instructions on management timing. It's pretty heavily detailed, so it can be a little overwhelming at first, but it's really good. And if you're from a different area than me, I'm in the Mid Valley. If you're from the South Valley or the North Valley or anywhere else, your local technical resource providers will be able to help you out. Some of those resource providers, of course, OSU Extension, NRCS, and your soil and water conservation districts. I have Polk highlighted here because our next speaker is Beth with the Polk SWCD. But reach out. They often have a lot of options. And sometimes NRCS has cost share programs, grants, etc., which can be really helpful when you want to implement, say, a brand new rotational grazing plan with a lot of new paddocks. And with that, I hate to do this, but my job requires that I am surveyed occasionally to make sure that I am being an effective teacher. And so if you don't mind, I will put a link in the chat just to, and it's all anonymous. So you could say I'm terrible, which could be so. I really welcome the feedback because it's very, very helpful. So the link is in the chat. If you don't mind, it should be like 2 minutes, maybe tops. But there's a chat there. And with that, I will take any questions. Let me stop sharing so I can see you all. Okay, I can see you all of your names on this beautiful screen. But yeah, if anybody has questions, we can pull them up in the chat. I put a question in Q&A. Are you going to look there? Yes, I will absolutely look there. Do livestock growers experience much grass tetany here in the Willamette Valley? Yes, it does happen, and I actually had a slide on it. But I had a slide on grass tetany and oh man, there's one more that has, well, it's like PEM or something like that. But yes, we do have grass tetany, and I can share a little bit more about that with you if you have questions. Biggest thing is making sure that you don't have, believe it's caused by like magnesium deficiency. And so you want to make sure that your grasses or the forage that is available is sufficient. And if not, you might need to supplement or keep them off depending on certain times. I'm not the expert on grass tetany, but I can definitely share some resources on that. I have another question here. I have several paddocks and I rotationally graze. The species from one paddock to the next are the same, and I can't graze them all at the late elongation stage. How do you recommend managing when to have animals enter each section? I completely understand. Yeah, no matter what, they'll just go in there. Once you start grazing at different intervals, they'll start growing back at slightly different intervals. If you have areas that are really stemmy and over mature, you can go in there before. It's mostly when you have those big clumps in your pasture when everything else is mowed down and then you have them. And it might be kind of depending, if you don't have enough animals for your site, it can also lead to issues where you have that happen, where you have so much forage that you're not utilizing it all. If you have smaller cows, won't have as much of a hard time, but sheep and goats, you might need to mow it a little bit if they're really not eating it but most of the time they'll start eating it, especially if it's in a smaller area. And, oh, yeah, and I will send the links in a follow-up email right after the presentation. So I will send a Word document with all of the links that I mentioned. So I'll send that out. And let's see. Yes, Jarvis mentioned the Pasture calendar is awesome. So yeah, highly recommend. It's really, really helpful. It just takes a little bit of time because it can be overwhelming at first because it includes several different regions across Oregon and Washington. And obviously that varies between Western Oregon, Eastern Oregon in different areas. So you just need to find your right spot. And let's see, any suggestions for sourcing pasture seed mixes? Pasture grass seed prices went way up in the last couple of years. Yeah, that's a tough one. I get questions all the time. Just about everything has really gone up in price, making it really hard. I don't necessarily have sourcing that's going to be a whole lot cheaper than other places. Just recommend shopping around. There's a lot of custom seed places. Not just kind of like your big farm and ranch stores, but there's also smaller custom seed places. And, if it's not cost effective for you to renovate at the moment, that's just an example, but, it might be best to just try to manage what you have for now. But yeah, maybe in my follow-up email, if you want to talk to me more about sourcing specific seed mixtures and different stuff, but it's just inflation's nuts. It's going to be expensive. But I can share more options. I have trouble with the take half, leave half because alpacas will absolutely ignore one type of grass. So even with the small pastures, the yummy stuff gets eaten away way down and they'll eventually go for the type. Yes. Some animals are a lot more picky and you're going to have issues. I think part of that is stocking density. So when animals, if they're in a smaller area and they're kind of forced to eat it, that helps. And I think that was on one of my slides where having too many animals and too little each come with their own problems. I know some animals are just picky and it's going to be hard. In that case, you might have to, again, mow a little more, leave them in there, let them get it down into a smaller area. But yeah, and I'm afraid that camelids are not my area of expertise. So we might need to talk with some other camelid producers to find out how they manage. If you are a camelid producer and you have suggestions, let me know or let us know in the chat. Yeah, too many animals in January and not enough in May. I get that a lot. And it looks like Melissa offered, I really like the diversity of seed offered by Green Cover out of the Midwest. Oh, to reseed. Some folks have mentioned talking to other farmers who may hold back seed and some are willing to share. Yeah, it's really good to get into farmer groups. I swear, farmers are so active on Facebook, which, take it with a grain of salt because it's the internet. But yeah, getting into some farmer forums. We have some farmer lists with OSU and across different areas. You could check around. How much seed would you need to completely reseed a 19-acre pasture? That is a great question. It depends on the seed. And when you are purchasing seed, it will come with a recommendation. And that's kind of, would go with that. It's all the seed, it's different recommendations for different mixes. Melissa offers also Hearn and Kings both offer forage herbs such as forage plantain, chicory, burnet, less common seeds like trefoil, berseem, and balansa. Yeah, and I didn't even get into alternative forages because, again, that's a whole nother class. But there are some great alternative forages that are more productive in hot summers that can be really helpful. And I have a colleague, Shayan Gajar, who is with the Organic Pasture and Forages System, who teaches classes on that. I'd be happy to get you in contact if you have questions. Yeah, and yeah, Karen mentions with rotational grazing, you're kind of forcing if you have your pasture size well matched to your stocking rate, they'll kind of have to eat the stuff that they don't like. But I did, yeah, in my research, I have heard that alpacas are pretty notorious for picking out what they want. So it looks like people have really added a bunch of seed sources. So thank you to everyone for sharing. And with that, I will pass things over to Beth Thiel with the Polk Soil and Water Conservation District. She's going to go into poisonous plants and managing weeds. So that kind of goes hand in hand, definitely goes hand in hand with pasture management. And just like to thank Beth for being here today and for agreeing to teach. So I'll pass it over to Beth. Just as long as you, unmute because I can't hear you yet. Whenever you're ready.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I had to escape and then go back. Okay, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you. Can you see my presentation okay?
Yep, we can see it. You're good to go and hear you.
And hear me. Great. All right. So my name's Beth Thiel, and I am a conservation planner with Polk Soil and Water Conservation District. And today I'm going to talk about pasture weeds, and particularly about weed species that can be harmful to the livestock. So we are going to hopefully present something for everyone about best management practices for controlling weeds and in identifying poisonous or injurious plants in your pasture. So we'll talk a little about preventing weeds and then a bit more about how to identify them, and then timing and ways for controlling invasive species. So we also have some polls in this presentation. Here is the first one that is, which best describes you? Thank you for adding some answers in there. That helps us to see who all's here. So a lot of people on 10 plus acres or 4 to 10 acres. That's great. Super. That's a lot to take care of. So we'll get into managing the pastures for weeds. Okay. But it's not letting me advance the slide. Is it stuck on the poll?
Yeah, you might need to re-click into your presentation.
Perfect. All right, so the best place to start is with at the source, right? So we just finished talking about pasture management and the ways to maintain really healthy pastures. So that is, of course, the best way to prevent weeds from coming into your pasture. So overgrazing is going to be the most impactful thing to your pastures and is going to cause more weed problems. And compaction in having animals on your saturated soils in the wintertime or in the rainy season is going to open up that soil for a lot of weed seeds to come in and cause havoc. So want to prevent that from happening at all costs. If you feel like there's an area in your pasture that's getting highly compacted, then that's the perfect place to think about doing a heavy use or a sacrifice area in your pasture. And Susie's going to talk more about that later on in the webinar series. So I really recommend paying attention to that one. As for management and timing, make sure you're taking care of the soil health as well. So like Hayley mentioned, you want to do soil samples and apply nutrients as needed to make sure that the grasses have everything they need to be healthy. And then know the timing of when it comes to weed control as well. So because when you notice the big flowering plants, then it's too late to control them. You want to be able to control them earlier on than that. So weeds will appear in even the best managed pastures. So of course, if you're doing everything perfectly, you're still going to have weeds that occur. It's just going to be part of your management system, is that you're going to be checking and controlling for your weeds. So the first step in doing that is identifying your weeds, because each type of weed is going to have a different method for control, or something that's more effective anyway. And you can do that by, I mean, everything from Google Lens, taking pictures of it and using Google Lens, that can help you. It's somewhat accurate sometimes, and then if it's not totally accurate, at least get you started in maybe the right genus or family. Great book resources. Weeds of the West is a great resource just for identifying what you're dealing with. Of course, the internet, OSU Ag Extension, and Master Gardeners. If you're taking a sample into Master Gardeners, don't just bring a leaf or a stem. You're going to want to bring as much of the plant as possible, the roots, the stems, the leaves, the flowers, and seeds. And then they'll have a lot better chance at being able to identify what you're dealing with. And then when it comes to taking care of your weed issue, we talk about integrated pest management. So that's a strategy to control pest species with the least possible hazards to people, property, and the environment. So it's less reliance on the chemical application, and you can work with biological controls, cultural controls, mechanical, and of course, chemical comes in there too, but it doesn't have to be your first option. And then, of course, continue evaluating and check for how effective your weed management has been, and if there's any new weed sources starting up. And let's talk about when poisonings happen for your livestock. You never want to turn hungry animals into an unfamiliar pasture. You want to make sure your livestock are well fed first. That way they eat more discriminately. Make sure there's plenty of good forage for the livestock to eat and water to drink. If they are too hungry, then they start to eat plants that they usually would avoid. A lot of people, have weeds growing in the pasture and think, oh, animals, they always know what to avoid. But that's not always true, and poisonings do happen, especially if the forage is thin for them to eat. Be careful about spraying poisonous plants and then grazing livestock in the same area too soon, because herbicides can cause the plants to wilt, obviously, but that can make them more palatable, and then animals are more likely to eat them. So you want to either wait to graze in the area where you have applied herbicide until the poisonous plants are completely died, and then you can remove the wilted portion of the plants, or make sure that the plant is completely dead and killed through the root system first. Never include poisonous plants in hay, obviously, because again, once they have dried or wilted, they can become more palatable, and that makes it difficult for animals to eat discriminately. So just make sure your animals have lots of forage, and then monitor and manage your pastures, always. So some common signs of toxicity in animals to look out for in case you're noticing some of these things in your livestock, then you want to definitely call your veterinarian as soon as possible. We'll talk a little bit more about some of these as we go through the presentation. So we're going to talk about 4 different categories. Forbs, it's basically everything that's not grasses, trees, or shrubs. So it's those flowering plants. And then the last category is actually injurious ones, not toxic necessarily. Okay, hole number 2. Do you have dangerous plants in your pasture? Yes, no, or you're not sure. Wow, it's kind of even. And share results. Pretty even. Thank you for putting in those answers. That's interesting. Okay. So let's start first about forbs. Everybody's favorite tansy ragwort. This is very prolific, I guess, in the Willamette Valley. It only takes about 4 to 8% of body weight in horses and cows for it to be fatal. So, for example, if a 1,200-pound cow would consume 48 pounds of the green plant, that's considered a lethal dose, but it's a cumulative. So this can occur in a single feeding, or it could occur over a period of months or years. And so tansy ragwort, to recognize it, is a dark, leafy, ruffly leaf. In its rosette form, you can see in a couple of pictures there. It can grow up to be 2 to 4 feet tall when it's flowering, and it has clusters of daisy-like yellow flowers, yellow petals. It contains a toxic alkaloid, which primarily affects the liver over time. So symptoms may not show up for months, and it's really hard to diagnose. Tansy ragwort remains toxic even when it's dry, so you want to make sure it's not in the hay. The best time to control this is in the spring before it flowers. So now is the perfect time. It can be pulled up easily when the ground is moist. So that's one control measure. So plants that are in flower stage can form viable seeds even after they're pulled. So you want to carefully bag and dispose of them, of flowered plants. If they've already flowered, you don't want to pull them, leave them on the ground. A, because they can still produce seeds and that doesn't solve your problem. And B, because it can become more palatable and then livestock might still eat it. So you want to pull the rosettes now as well that you see. Also, applying a broadleaf herbicide to the plant during the rosette stage is shown to be successful. And just make sure, and whenever you're using a herbicide, you want to make sure you're following the label exactly and wearing protective clothing, etc. Mowing is not a good control measure for tansy ragwort. Plants can regrow and flower again in the same season when it's mowed. And plants are regularly mowed, they can persist and become short-lived perennials, and they can flower below the level of the mower. And that might also, mowing it might also increase the toxin in the plant. So not the best control method for tansy. Related to tansy, this is the same toxin in this common ground cell. This is poisonous to cattle and horses, contains alkaloids that cause irreversible liver damage. It's the same one that's in tansy. The plant is usually a winter annual and it grows 4 to 18 inches tall. Flower heads are numerous throughout the plant with the little yellow disc flowers, but they don't have the ray flowers, so no petals that go around the outside of the flower. Most poisonings occur by feeding contaminated hay with this one. Some animals may not die from poisonings, but will remain in poor shape. And cattle and horses are the most seriously affected, not so much goats or sheep. Can be controlled with tillage in the fall and spring. And this is like an annual, easy to pull as well. Foxglove, so really pretty flower, biennial plant. So you'll see in the first year of its growth, the very vigorous leafy plant, and it won't flower until the following year. Symptoms of this are rapid breathing. If there's poisoning, the symptoms are rapid breathing, irregular heartbeat, diarrhea, and convulsions. Poisonings of livestock from this plant are infrequent because it's pretty unpalatable. So this most often a poisoning would occur again if it gets into hay. So really important to check your hay for anything that looks unusual, not something that you would expect to have in your hay. So when the poisonings do occur, it's pretty dramatic and severe and often results in death. So something to be really careful about. Milkweed. So this is really great for monarch butterflies. And it's probably the reason why monarch butterfly caterpillars are toxic to birds and monarchs are, because the white sap in the milkweed is toxic to animals as well. So just be cautious about, I know a lot of people plant this out to support monarch butterflies, but just be cautious to not plant this in your pastures. Poison hemlock. So this is in the carrot family. It can cause skin irritation in humans as well. So you want to be really careful to wear protective clothing, gloves, and long-sleeved shirts. It can irritate your skin. It's easily confused with lookalikes, but pretty easy to tell the difference when you think about a few different characteristics. For instance, the stems are hairless and they have these purple blotches on there. Very feathery, fine leaves as well. And if you pinch the leaves, you'll smell a funny smell, kind of a little bit musty, that's like a little bit like mouse pee. So combination of those different characteristics, and you'll know that you probably have poison hemlock. This can grow to be quite tall. And animals generally avoid this plant when there's other plentiful forage available, but signs of poisoning will appear within an hour after the animal eats the plant, and they would die from respiratory paralysis within 2 to 3 hours. So it's pretty serious poisonous plant. Controlling this guy, mowing has been shown to be effective if it is at the right stage. And that stage would be when it starts to bolt towards flowering, but before it has flowered. If you mow after flowering, research has shown that it actually, you can make the problem worse. It can actually spread. So mowing can be effective, I guess, with this guy, but generally you're going to want to, in the springtime, while the soils are moist and pliable, try to dig it out as much as you can. So again, those characteristics, real feathery leaves, and no hairs on the stems, and blotchy purple. Water hemlock, a close relative, frequently called the most toxic plant in the Northwest. This plant grows along waterways, and it only takes a piece of a root the size of a walnut to kill a horse. So it is really toxic. This is another that is also poisonous to humans, so be sure to be careful if you are handling it at all. It isn't as common to find these in pastures, but it's just a good one to be aware of. That root segment is almost hollow, as you can see in that picture. That's one way to distinguish it from other plants in that family. So it looks somewhat like poison hemlock, the flowers especially, but the leaves are less feathery and it has that bulbous root. Bracken fern. So bracken fern has broad triangular leaves or fronds with branching stems. So that's its distinguishing feature. The plant can grow to a height of 2 to 4 feet, but it can get much bigger. It grows directly from a stout horizontal root stalk instead of growing from a center place and growing out from a center place. It grows along a long stem, can travel out rhizomatously along the ground for a while and sends up stems that will then branch out. This contains thiaminase inhibitor that leads to a development of thiamine deficiency. And research has also indicated that it is carcinogenic as well. All parts of the plant are poisonous, whether green or it's dried, harvested in hay. So again, it's something to look out for in hay. Cattle poisonings have occurred during late summer when other feed is scarce. So you really have to watch the forage availability, or when animals are fed hay with bracken fern in it. So they have to consume quite a large amount, but that has occurred. And it's in cows and sheep. You'll see a fever, loss of appetite, difficulty breathing, and this is cumulative as well. And livestock affected only after they have eaten considerable amounts for like 2 to 4 weeks. This can be controlled in areas where cultivation is practical. The plants can be managed, and if you can cultivate for like 2 to 3 years. So repeated cultivation will eventually take care of this as a problem, where you would obviously then want to reseed. And there are also herbicides that are labeled to take care of that. Here is our next poll. See if we can identify which one of these is poison hemlock, A or B. You might have to move your poll around. Yeah, most people guessing B. We're looking for those splotchy stems that have no hairs on them and real feathery leaves. These guys both have feathery leaves. Very good. Excellent job. So we're just looking for the splotchy stem as well as no hairs on the stem. This other one is wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace. That's A, is Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot. Not toxic. And B is poison hemlock. Thank you, everybody, for taking the poll. Okay. Oh, another poll question. Is this a bracken fern? Yes or no? Thank you for participating. So bracken fern comes up from a long rhizomatous stem that goes out through the ground, not from a central round location. So this guy is not a bracken fern, actually, because it's mostly radiating out from a center location. Excellent. Awesome. Good job. All right. All right, on to a few more of these forbs that you don't want to have in your pastures. So yellow star thistle, not super common in the Willamette Valley, but it is found in many other parts of Oregon. And so if you're getting your hay from other areas in the state, this is one you want to look out for. This appears to only affect horses. Other livestock, it doesn't affect so much, but you don't want to have this in your hay, especially if you have horses. So you'll see cottony hairs on the leaves, but the telltale sign are these really pointed long spears on the flower head. So yes, again, this one is not common, but it is important to check your hay source for this guy. Yeah. Okay, so we'll move on to larkspur. So larkspur, beautiful plant, a beautiful flower, many native varieties in the area. It's one to look out for. This causes heavy cattle losses in the western states where they range in areas where there is larkspur. That's common, and it's really affects cattle because it's highly palatable to cows. They really like the taste of larkspur. So losses could be expected there, where cows are grazing in areas where there's a lot of larkspur. So just one you want to watch out for. Make sure that you don't have this in your pasture. If you do, you might want to fence it off, fence so they don't have access to it, or remove it. You can pull it, or there's herbicides that would work as well. Okay, we have St. John's wort. So cattle and sheep will normally not eat mature St. John's wort if they have other forage. So again, it's making sure that there's enough other stuff for them to eat. But hay containing dried St. John's wort is still toxic and will cause poisonings. Signs of poisonings will appear 2 to 21 days after the animal begins to graze on St. John's wort, and it causes photosensitization. And so that means that the skin is really sensitized to sunlight, especially where the hair is thin, like on the muzzle or ears or eyelids. Animals that eat St. John's wort and then are exposed to direct sunlight develop severe burns and redness, swelling, eyelid irritation, sloughing skin in the affected areas, etc. So these guys, they look a little bit like tansy, but the leaves, if you picked off one of these little leaves, it's not the curly ruffled leaf of a tansy. And you can pick off one little leaf and you can hold it up to the light and you can see little pinpricks through the light or through the leaf. And that's a telltale sign of St. John's wort. These small dots contain the toxic substance. They're 5-petaled flowers that grow in a cluster on the plant. If you have livestock and you see there are signs of photosensitization, you should immediately take them out of the sunlight if that's possible, and call your vet. This can be controlled by digging or pulling in the springtime and with properly labeled herbicides as well. False dandelion or cat's ear dandelion. This is, again, another one that is primarily affects horses. So this can contribute to a condition called string halt in horses, a neurological condition that causes mobility issues in the hind legs of horses. So there have been some characteristics they've noticed of horses that have string halt, and the situation in which this happens. Horses, it's usually when they've been grazing in late summer, when it's hot and dry, and there's limited forage in their pasture, and there's false dandelion in the pastures, and that's when they notice that horses have been affected by string halt, and they think that that is a cat's ear. So these can be confused easily with common dandelion, which is not toxic, but there are some easy physical differences to notice a difference, mainly in the flower that develops. So dandelion will have a single hollow stem that has a flower at the end of it, and the cat's ear will have more of a fibrous stem that comes up from the center, but then branches off and will have multiple flowers off of that single stem. It's challenging to control this guy. It requires multiple management strategies. Digging can be effective at well-timed herbicides. Plants should be sprayed before flower buds appear or in the fall on the rosettes. So you'll see rosettes in the spring or the fall with the cat's ear dandelion, and that's a good time to spray it. Buttercup. So this guy comes in early springtime. 5-lobed little flowers, waxy, shiny petals, and they grow in wet areas in early spring. And so if it's a really wet area, maybe you don't want to have livestock in there anyway, but if it's a part of your pasture, then it is something you're going to want to take care of. Signs of poisoning include an irritated mouth membranes, frothing, and diarrhea and abdominal distress in the animals. For control, buttercup can be pulled and dug up when the ground is soft and moist. Repeated cultivation can help, but you need to be careful because the seeds that have been dropped, if it's been there for quite a long time, the seeds will last up to 20 years, and so you might be exposing more seeds, etc. So you need to stay on top of it and continue your control practices there to make sure you get it replanted into something that's good forage. Not recommended to mow buttercup, but there are broadleaf herbicides that can be effective for that one. Horsetail and scouring rush is another thing to keep an eye on that can end up in hay. It is toxic when it's dried as well. Be familiar with it. I think everybody recognizes this horsetail as something that's segmented. You can pull apart in little segments. Symptoms would just be if an animal was poisoned, weight loss, diarrhea, weakness, leading to immobility. So it can be serious. Death camas. So death camas is a white flower and can be confused before it's flowering with a common camas, which is a nice purple flower that is not at all toxic and is used, has been used traditionally, that the roots have been dug and eaten for thousands of years. Death camas, however, is toxic, and all parts of it are toxic. So you want to just make sure that you can identify it first. So you have to wait till it flowers, and you're going to look for that white flower, smaller flowers, and they are always white, and it blooms later than the common camas. So once you've identified it, then you dig the bulb out in order to remove it. And that is one you definitely want to avoid. Okay, can anyone identify what this plant is? And I think this one, you would just go ahead and put it into the chat. Nice. Yep. All right. No one here is fooled. This is false dandelion or cat's ear, not a regular dandelion. Nicely done. Okay, moving on. So we're going to talk a little bit about grasses, and really, this is not the grasses that are toxic or injurious. These guys aren't. This is about endophytes. So they can contain endophytes, and that's a fungus that grows between the plant cells and into the developing seed. So some endophytes are toxic to livestock, and you can't see or tell if it has this fungus on it. So many turf varieties will have an endophyte in it that could be harmful to your livestock. It's mostly a problem with breeding animals. It can cause reproductive problems and birth defects. So if you're familiar with what's in your pasture, what the seed mix is, and it's fairly new, then it's most likely that you have the new and improved varieties that are endophyte free, or they have a novel endophyte that does not have toxics in it. But if you're worried about your pasture, you're not sure what the seed mix was, or how long ago it was, or how old it was, and it might have turf species in it, then you can take that to the OSU Endophyte Lab, and Hayley will provide a link with information for that in the follow-up email. So before feeding straw or screening materials from unknown or toxic endophyte infected grass seed fields, because that might be available here where we grow a lot of grass seeds, you'll want to have that tested at the lab. Okay, next is trees and shrubs, and I'll probably burn through this quickly. This slide in particular is basically to just say, when you are pruning your trees in your yard, good job, but don't throw all of those clippings over the fence into the pasture to get them out of the way of the yard, because oftentimes those ornamental plants in our yards can be toxic, and we don't really think about it. So just as a habit, don't throw them over there. Don't make a burn pile or a compost pile in the pasture where the animals will have access to it. And this can include fallen apples and pears. Not always a good idea to dump wheelbarrow loads full of apples and things into animals. It can cause colic if they eat too many. So be careful about that. Now, for horses in particular, red maple is actually something you want to keep an eye out for. So red maple, if you have a maple in your area, just see what type it is. This one is particularly toxic for horses. Poisonings are especially likely to happen in the fall or following a storm, like when leaves or branches fall into a pasture and become accessible to the horses. The fresh green leaves are apparently non-toxic, but once they're wilted or dried, then they're toxic and they can remain toxic for up to 30 days. So you don't want to mess around with that one. The bark is also toxic, and other maple species like sugar maple, that's been suspected of also causing some problems with horses. So know what kind of maple you have and do some research on it. The toxin in here will destroy red blood cells, and so it will induce breathing difficulties. Black walnut. So this is toxic to horses and dogs, and it can be a problem in your pasture paddock or adjacent to it. So you don't want them to be able to have access to eating the leaves at all or the fruit. But also you need to be careful about the bedding and whether if you have wood shavings, make sure that that hasn't come from black walnut. That can also cause problems for horses. Horse bedding on shavings or sawdust containing that can develop colic, edema, and laminitis. So double check your sources when you're getting your wood chips. Horse chestnut. This is toxic to cattle, sheep, horses, swine, chickens. This is just one to watch out for. It's another ornamental plant that you might have around that you don't want to prune and throw over into the pasture. It causes gastrointestinal and central nervous system problems. The yew plant. So this is a native to the Northwest, but it's a common ornamental in people's yards, a really lovely tree, but we want to make sure this is not being pruned and thrown into the pastures. It's toxic to cattle, horses, sheep, llamas, and birds. The only part I think that's not toxic is the little fleshy red berry, but the seeds inside are. So don't feed these clippings to any of the animals. And this also causes respiratory failure. And the prunus species. So this includes your cherries and plums, peaches, the pit fruits. This has cyanide. So all parts of the plant contain a cyanogenic glycoside, except the ripe berry that we eat. But like the red maple, the wilted leaves are more toxic than when they're fresh. So keep that in mind. All members of this family contain the cyanogenic glycosides in the stems, the leaves, and the seeds. And the concentrations increase when the plant is stressed by drought or by frost. And the cyanide potential is highest in the new growth of the plant. Yeah, so be wary of that. Does anyone want to drop in the chat what they think this plant is? That must have been an easy one. Good job. Everybody knows that one. It is the yew plant. Okay, last section is the injurious plants. So injurious plants, it's mostly annual grasses, everybody's favorite, after tansy ragwort. These ones are even harder to control if it's a big population. These grasses have sharp awns that can injure eyes and noses and ears and the skin of livestock. The awns have these barbs, these sharp pointy barbs on them that can help the awn inch their way into skin and not come out. As the animal moves, it just barbs its way farther and farther into the skin and becomes a problem. Some of these annual grasses are kind of hard to tell apart, but the management for them is pretty similar. If you have a serious problem with these weeds, you won't be able to do much without spraying a non-selective herbicide. So a herbicide that is not just for grasses and not just for broadleafs, but it will kill all plants that it comes into contact with. That's a non-selective. And once you've killed it out and you might take more than one application, then you can start from scratch with reseeding. So the suggested treatment there would be treating the grasses and also doing soil testing to see where you need to fertilize, what your soil needs to support healthy forages and legumes for your pasture, but also then the herbicide treatments, and then you work the ground and then reseed, and then you're going to manage your desirable plants. So it's a long process, but worth it if you have a bad infestation. So first one is ripgut brome. Great name, right? And I think it is named that for just what you think it is, because those barbs on the awn can actually adhere to the inner lining of the gut, the intestines, and cause problems in your animals. So these are annual plants. They don't have deep root systems. You can hoe them out in the springtime, that they seed quickly. So you got to keep an eye on them. You can't wait till next week to go and if there's a small patch to dig them out, you want to get on it as quickly as you can. Some of these can be grazed in the early stages because they're not injurious yet until they have formed their seeds. But the best, defense against these, of course, is to establish your perennial grasses and a healthy stand of them. Early season grazing at adequate stocking rates can be effective. Mowing can reduce seed accumulation, but it must be timed perfectly, and plants will likely regrow and at a shorter stand they will seed. And so mowing is not very effective with these guys. Repeat tilling can be effective, followed by seeding. Another brome, downy brome. This one's more hairy along its stem. There is a new effective chemical out there. It's a pre-emergent called Rejuvra that has been shown to be effective against the bromes and medusa head, and especially when it's in combination with a post-emergent like Plateau apparently. So timing's important there, where I guess if it especially with medusa head, where there's a lot of vegetation on the ground, if there's a thick layer of medusa head seed heads from past years, that vegetation can hold onto some of that herbicide application. And so you want to time it with rains actually to make sure it doesn't just get soaked up by that vegetation on the ground. So timing can be really important, but also this is same as the other one. Annual grass can be pulled out easily for small infestation. So medusa head, very similar. Establishing a perennial grasses is your best defense. And with medusa head, that does have that thick thatch that can be created from a couple years of growth of medusa head on the ground. You want to try and remove that when you're applying any kind of herbicide, especially a pre-emergent herbicide that would hold that or bind that up. Yeah. Oh, wrong way. Foxtail barley, also called squirrel tail. It's a perennial that can act like an annual. And this guy, if it's a real thick, a really large infestation, you might use a non-specific herbicide like glyphosate. Mowing is ineffective for this guy because it will send up another shorter seed head stalk. So that's not recommended, but you can dig it out and pull it out in the spring. And in its earlier stages, it can be grazed before the seed heads come out and the awns become problematic. And then hair barley, another barley. This is often called wild barley. It's a winter annual grass. The stems are round in a cross section. That's a difference for it. And it grows like prostrate, but then angles up like that in the picture. And this can be pulled in the spring, or you can dig it out before the seeds develop and hit the ground. And it could also be grazed early in the spring, and then herbicides can be used. But if it's not a big infestation, just pulling that and getting rid of it before seeds hit the ground. So another annual barley type. Main objective in controlling any weed really is, including the annual grasses, is just to prevent the seeds from forming and hitting the ground. So small patches can be removed by digging by hand, pulling them out. The entire plant should be uprooted before the spike formation. So before they start going to seed. Research with this one shows mowing can reduce the number of seed heads it will eventually produce. Even if you mow it, it might reduce some of the seeds, so not super effective. And it can be grazed as well in the earlier part of the year. Burning at the ripe seed stage has been shown to be a really effective control for this, but I, caution anyone who would be burning to be very careful about that, because you wouldn't want to accidentally start any kind of a fire. So only very controlled, but obviously you could also pull these, and burning would be an effective controlled way to destroy all the seeds. Yeah. Last one is not a grass, actually. This is tarweed, and it is not injurious, so to speak. It just has this resin on it that can get all over your animal's fur. This readily self-seeds. It's an annual. It's home in the moist Pacific Northwest, and it's abundant in wet meadows in the Willamette Valley. And the seed is actually a food source for birds and for rodents and for humans. This plant, sorry about that, is the entire plant is incredibly sticky and has a very distinct smell. So like I said, it will can stick onto fur, and it carries dirt and dust with it. So it can be just a real nuisance. You can try to control this by mowing this guy before it has bolted, or just when it's starting to bolt. So the stems are up there, and then you can cut it. Hand pulling or digging small infestations is an option, and applying herbicide at the right time of year, like many of the weeds in this presentation, can also be effective, just following those labels. Okay, I think this might be the last poll. You could put in the chat, what makes this plant problematic? Anyone wants to guess on why this is a problematic plant that you do not want to have in your pasture? Yeah, great. It's a sticky seed head because it has barbs on those awns that will work its way into skin. And if they've eaten it, it can actually cause problems in their digestive system. Nice. Excellent. Thank you. So that's a Medusa head. Okay, we're going to talk timing really quickly. Timing of weed control and management. Hey, it's springtime. This is our very best time to control weeds in our pastures. So now is the time when you're at the rosette stage. So all the leaves in a nice circle down at the ground level. And that's what you want to see for control. And the ground is nice and soft and easier to pull weeds out of. So now is your best time to go out and do your monitoring, find your weeds, and control them. And of course, if you're using herbicides, this is the best time as well, because the plants are actively growing at this stage. And that means they're more likely to pull the herbicide into their plant system, and that will be more effective then. In the summertime, not the best time to pull weeds because the ground is so dry, but also herbicides are not as effective because the plants are not as actively growing. So summertime is more a time if you see weeds and you have some time and you want to deal with them, you can cut them. And but again, if it's a toxic weed, you don't want to leave those in the pasture because they become more palatable, but also because if you see flowers on a weed and you cut it, it's likely it can still, some plants can still form seeds that then can just drop there on the ground. So has flowers on there, you want to, if you're going to cut it, put it into a bag and dispose of it out of the pasture. In the fall can also be a good time to manage weeds after the rains return, and you can pull or dig if the soil's moist, and you want to take mature seeded plants away at that time as well. Make sure to monitor again in the spring and pull or apply herbicides to regrowth. So anytime you're doing any kind of weed work, you want to try to put that in your new journal and return to that area in the following seasons to check how effective it has been. And where you've pulled and you've left bare space, you want to reseed if you can. Rake some seeds in there in the fall. It's not going to work to rake it in the summertime. It's going to be too dry. But in the spring or fall, that can help with those bare patches. In the winter, you want to keep your animals off the saturated pastures in a heavy use area. And those big hooved animals can cause compaction that will reduce the forage overall and the health of your pastures, and that's when the weeds come in. So year-round, be aware of the toxic plants on your property. Make sure you're following best management practices, like using the heavy use areas and not overgrazing. And take care of your grass stand. Oopsie, did it again. Yeah, so year round, just follow your best management practices for your pasture. Let's see, I think we have, which practices? Let's do this one. Which practices can minimize the risk of poisoning? If anyone wants to hazard a guess in the chat. Which practices can minimize? So when we might have some animals coming into a new pasture, yeah, great. Feed animals before putting them into the pasture. Yeah, take care of your weeds while they're small. Pull and spot spray. Excellent. Yeah. So we want to make sure that our animals are not lacking forage and feeding them before you put them out onto pasture, if that's an option. And obviously just looking for at all times how your pastures are doing and noticing what weeds are there and what's present and knowing what weeds are. And so you know the best and most effective way to manage them. So in review, we are maintaining healthy pastures, following all the advice that Hayley has to offer, understand the life cycle of your weeds. So you got to know the name of your weed so you understand its life cycle so you can target its weakness. And you're going to use integrated weed management strategies to manage your invasive species. So not just relying heavily on herbicide, but there's lots of biocontrols that work for tansy ragwort, for instance, that can help to manage it. Oftentimes you can't use that alone. You can't use biocontrol alone, but you can use that with cultural or mechanical practices and then rely on herbicides if those aren't effective. So some resources that are available. And again, these will be sent out as well. So the OSU Extension, of course, has many, many resources. This is the small farms web page. These will be included. If you go down here, there's the pastures link here, and beautifully set up, many different resources there. Weeds and poisonous plants over here in the far corner to check out those. So many great resources. The Pacific Northwest Handbook is particularly useful for identifying the best herbicides to use on your weed problems. They have a somewhat finicky little box here to fill out what it is you're trying to control. Let's see, hemlock. I put in hemlock. So we have water hemlock or poison hemlock. You can click on that and it will give you some examples of the various herbicides that are useful against that particular plant. Okay, I guess that is the end there. Thanks again for having me, Hayley.
Thank you for being here, Beth. Great presentation. And we do have some questions in the chat, and there is a question in the Q&A section as well. Would you like me to read those to you, or do you want to just go through them?
Let's see. In the question and answer, where does annual ryegrass fall in terms of weeds? And it can be considered a weed, and Hayley's going to jump in and help me because I'm new to the area and new to pasture
That's
management.
okay. Were you maybe it was meant during like the endophyte
right
section?
Oh, okay.
If I'm not, in case I'm wrong, let me know. But and again, like most people are not going to have a problem with endophytes. Unless you have a really, really old pasture that was converted from an old grass seed field or something, it's really not too big of an issue. And I think somebody also mentioned in the chat that certain conditions can increase it, but we don't see it too often in the valley. But I will add, we do have a kind of an endophyte handout, endophyte toxins in grass and other feed sources, that is based in Western Oregon, and I will add that to my list of resources. I'll send to you. Let's see. Another one is Japanese maple a red maple? I tried to look into this one a little more. With the ornamentals, it can be really hard to determine if they're toxic or not, because only some will be listed. What I read is a lot of maples can be toxic to horses. Typically, it's not as big of an issue with other livestock with the maples. You know, if you have one relatively close and you don't notice anybody really going to town on it or anything, it's probably not going to be an issue. Sheep and goats are a lot less susceptible to things like that. So it shouldn't really be a problem. There's just not a lot of information available on specifically Japanese maple. And with maples, it's mostly about horses as well. And let me just kind of catch up here.
See one here is lupin poisonous, and there was a slide specific to lupin that maybe was accidentally skipped over. So that does cause some problems occasionally. Horses aren't as susceptible. Some lupins are not poisonous to livestock at all, but some species can cause birth defects. It's just important to be aware of. Cows and sheep are more susceptible to poisonings. They're pretty easy to identify. Some of them, you know, they're native to the area, and some of them are even listed as sensitive species. So, yeah, if you do have them, if they are an issue, it might be something you want to fence away from. But if you have plenty of forage in your pasture, they shouldn't be a problem. But yeah, they can cause problems for some animals. Types of clover that are toxic to horses. So I've heard red clover can be particularly problematic. Not Hayley, can you chime in there? That's more to do with also with a fungus, I think.
Yeah, some of them can be infected with fungus. Some clover spots, especially in kind of cooler, wetter weather, can provide a breeding ground. And horses can be a little more susceptible to it. But again, if you're following the rules of not having, more than 50% in your mix, and not grazing first thing in the morning when it's cool and wet, and it's after pastures have dried out, if they haven't already been kind of in that area, you're less likely to have issues. Let's see. It looks like, should we put in an irrigation system, or can a pasture be self-sufficient during the summertime? And real quick, I just want to make sure I respect people's time. You don't have to stay on later if you don't want to. If you're interested in the questions, we'll answer some more while we have time. But we will be back on this Thursday at 6 p.m. for minerals for grazing livestock and the chat with the vet about when to call your vet, what to have in your med kit, and common things to look out for. So back to the irrigation system. If you have water rights, because that's kind of the biggest limiter, as many people don't have access to water rights. If you have water rights, if you have the resources to put in some irrigation, it can really be helpful over the summertime when we, hit that slump in August or late July sometimes, to kind of, decrease those rest times, help out your plants. It just depends on what you have and what you're willing to do, because it can really be helpful, but it's not required. If you have the means, do it. Sorry, I don't have a good answer to that. If you have an irrigation system, it's really, really helpful, but not everybody has the means, and a lot of people plant alternative forages. When is the best time to till the pasture? That's a really good question. That's going to be covered in our renovation section. They're going to go kind of in depth. Typically, kind of spring and fall is when you want to do your work on your pasture, but it really depends on what your management goals are, what problems you're having, why you are going to till. That can really affect kind of best timing. Usually you want to start some prep in the spring and then do your real renovation in the fall. I don't know about comfrey. I don't have a lot of experience with that. It looks like there's kind of some different opinions online. So that is something I will have to research a little bit. And Melissa, feel free to reach out to me on that. Cause yeah, I'm kind of seeing some different stuff there. Missing anything else? I think we got most of it. If I missed your question, please, you can unmute or put it in chat. I'm not purposely trying to skip.
I don't see any other ones.
Yeah. Then yeah, we have looks like, somebody asked about Scotch broom. It's not one that is a real issue in terms of toxicity with livestock in our area, so it wasn't covered. However, it is a real pain to manage, and it will just completely take over landscapes. And so we do have resources that can help with some kind of management tips with Scotch broom, and I will include that in my resource sheet. And if you're waiting on the resource sheet, I have it all ready to go except for anything that was mentioned during the Q&A period. So I will get those added and get that sent off to you. So yeah, you are all very welcome, and thank you for supporting our programs and for being here. We really appreciate you. So we will see you on Thursday at 6 p.m. If you have any questions at all, concerns, you can give me a call or email and we'll get you set up.